My name is Lillie Devereux Blake. I was born in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1833. My family at the time owned a plantation and owned a lot of land in the South. My father and mother did not wish to remain in the South and actually were not for having human property. And so we made a trip to move north. While we were traveling to the north, my father grew ill and passed away. And my mother was pregnant at the time with who would be my younger sister, named Georgina, after my father, George. And my mother certainly did not wish to return to the South for any reason, so she purchased and we made a home in Connecticut. In Connecticut, I was attending the Apthorpe School for Young Ladies, which was a very prestigious school for the area and for the time. And my childhood was very full of parties and horse riding and lessons in French, piano lessons, sledding outside in the winter. I really had a positive childhood. I would say, a rebellious teenager. I was not one to, I was someone who did not appreciate the status of women from a very early age. And so I had a bit of a rebellious nature in me as a teenager. I did not get to attend college. However, I was tutored by a Yale student, and that was the equivalent of a Yale education for that time. So in my education and in my rebelliousness, I really tried to comment on and advance the cause of women, which I believed was necessary, that women should have a different place in the world. And but among many things, marriage was always an issue for me. Yes, women were required and supposed to get married, and of course I did eventually, but I considered marriage to be more of a profession than a life partnership, because for women, marriage was your profession. And I thought that women really should have the opportunity to become educated and obtain an actual profession where they could earn a living, rather than marrying someone to support them for their living. So I received five proposals of marriage in the years preceding my eventual marriage to Frank Umstead. But naturally, not every proposal or engagement followed through. It was Frank Umstead that I married in 1855, and he was a lawyer, presumably one of the more appropriate suitors for myself, especially with my mother, considering. My mother played a very important role in my life, and while she very much advocated for the traditional role of a woman, she herself did not have a traditional role, because she never remarried after the death of my father, and she had enough income to support herself, myself, and my sister throughout my entire youth. So really, she was a model of rebellion herself, and yet did not approve of some of my rebelliousness. So after my marriage to Frank Umstead, what is painfully clear is that as soon as a woman was married, all of her assets became her husband's assets. And so that was true for me. I had a large dowry due to the number of properties that my family had and the inheritances that I had. And all of that became my husband's property upon our marriage. We took a lengthy honeymoon traveling around most of the Northeast of the United States and partially into the Midwest before returning back to the East Coast to settle in New York City area. In 1857, I gave birth to my first daughter, named after me. My real name is Elizabeth, but my father gave me the nickname of Lillie when I was 2 or 3 years old. And so my first daughter's name is Elizabeth, but we called her Bessie. And then in 1858, my second daughter, Catherine, was born. So they were very close in age. I had a strong desire to still assert myself as an individual entity and to earn my own living. And so I had always had an interest in writing. Writing was always a passion of mine. And so I worked on my first book right after Catherine was born. And that was published in 1859. That text is called Southwold. So the first publication was in February of 1859. And it was a positive thing because for a number of reasons, but it was positive because it was a way for us as a family to earn additional income that at the time we were needing. But it was in May of that same year that I awoke one morning to find my husband deceased. He was sitting in a chair near me, and still warm, but it was apparent that he had been cleaning his gun as the gun was still on his lap, and there was blood dripping from his temple. So 2 days after my husband's passing, I received an offer of marriage, and this was typical for the time and not a pleasant experience for me, certainly, as I once again contemplated this idea of earning my own living apart from marriage. So once again, marriage was this profession that a woman was supposed to have, and here I was, a widow in my early 20s. And it was expected that I would marry again. However, I was determined not to. So I did return to spend time with my mother. I returned to my mother's house in Connecticut with my daughters and stayed there. And then, of course, the country went into a great upheaval. So my husband passed in 1859, and a couple of years later, we were faced with the challenge of knowing that I came from the South, knowing that I was born in the South. I nevertheless was raised among abolitionists, and I can remember being on the New Haven Green when the Umstead trials were happening. So, although I was very young at that time. So it really there was not much question as to where our allegiance would lie. We really had no loyalty to the South, and thus it was the Union that we chose to defend. Now, I was, like a number of other women contemporaries of mine, I really struggled with being a woman again, this time because I wished to take up arms and defend what I believed in, defend the union that I supported. I was elected and supposed to be the president of a group of women in the area who were sewing socks for the soldiers. But there wasn't anything I really hated more than sewing, and so there was absolutely no way that I was going to take part in that. Instead, I again thought, can I earn my own living and do it with something that I'm already good at? So by that time, by 1861, I had published my first book. I had published a couple other shorter pieces as well. And so I decided to travel to Washington City and do more of what I was good at. My mother was not supportive of this, although I did leave my younger daughter with her. Catherine was about 2 at the time, and so I took Bessie, who was about 4, with me. And so we traveled, and along the way I contracted with a number of different papers and was going to be paid $10 per letter that I wrote once a week. And so we traveled to Washington City, and we spent several months there. I do have a number of important contacts through my mother and through our family. One of my cousins is Eli Whitney Jr., so we have that on one side. But another cousin of mine was the president of Yale. And so I was able to get into circles in Washington City due to my family connections. I was also escorted to the opening of Congress in 1861 and was able to meet with a number of different generals in the time that I was there. Now, as a journalist, as a female, I was mostly writing about different social occurrences in Washington City at the time. But I was also writing fiction, and it was actually my fictional war stories that were the most popular. And they were published in Fournet's War Press. And I was writing many of those all throughout my time. And because I was inspired by what was around me and what different individuals were telling me. And also in time that we were there, myself and Bessie, we spent some time visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals. And Bessie unfortunately contracted typhoid fever. However, she did overcome that. However, it was right around the same time when President Lincoln's son passed of the same illness. So I did feel a stronger connection to the president and his wife, who I had met, due to having a very similar experience to them. But after being in Washington City for a number of months, my mother finally got the better of me and persuaded me to return to Connecticut to my other daughter, even though, in spite of the fact that I really did not wish to do that, which is not to say I wished to be apart from my daughter, but I wished to do what I felt I needed to do. You know, as a woman, I could not fight a battle. However, I could write and dispense information and give people something to read about and maybe hope for. So I did return to Connecticut, and I resumed writing. I wrote another novel published in 1863. And although I had not planned to remarry per se, I did eventually meet someone else that I had strong feelings for and was married in 1866. But that meant that I had been single from 1859 till 1866 and had supported myself during that entire time. Now, my second husband, Grenfell Blake, initially worked on his own. However, he was very ill, and for the vast majority of our marriage, he was unable to really offer any financial support. Interestingly enough, my second husband, was one of the individuals who was instrumental in pushing me to join the women's rights suffrage movement. And I was somebody who was well known, who was I had made a name for myself through my writing, through everything that I had done up to that point. But because I had always been a champion of women's rights in many different ways, it seemed natural to progress to women's suffrage. I still remember walking in New York up to the building where I would meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony for the first time. And of course, they were very prominent figures long before I came along. And so it was a very surreal experience. But as soon as I joined that movement, I was no longer invited to the social events that I had previously been invited to. My friends no longer kept in contact with me. And I was effectively written out of society in a sense. But as I mentioned, it was unusual, I think, for that time that my husband was extremely supportive of my participation in the women's movement. And then my sister was also supportive as well, but no one else that I had been close with kept in contact with me. Women's suffrage was a cause that I championed readily. And one of the things that I started to do, which is one of the other professions that a lot of women did, was lecturing. So I started to travel and lecture on different women's related issues, which was not an easy task. Traveling and lecturing was very tiresome. And there were many times where I was very ill while doing it. However, I felt that this was certainly a worthy effort to make, and that I should do my best to support the other women and the cause. Unfortunately, as with any other human endeavor, the women's suffrage movement had a number of different splits, and I was essentially a casualty, we'll say, of those splits. And where once I had a close relationship with Miss Anthony, that relationship deteriorated, and I was no longer one of the most prominent figures in the movement. I also went on to champion women's access to education. It was very important to me, having two daughters, that women should have a right to attend college. Other areas of women's rights that I found very important included having a female policewoman in a jail when women were arrested for whatever reason, because it was initially that women who were arrested did not have any woman in there, and it was just men. And I actually worked with Theodore Roosevelt on that issue. Unfortunately, my death was in 1913, which was prior to women's getting the right to vote. And much like a number of other women who worked so long and so hard on that subject, I did not get to see it come to fruition.